first off, I just want to thank you guys all for coming and talking. I love it at the end of the day on the last day of the conference. So, I guess how many of you are soccer fans, obviously, since the final is going on right now. So, my name is Tyler Owen, and the title of my talk today is AAA Indie, Big Games, Small Teams, and Tiny Budgets. But honestly, that's a little bit of a stretch. Today is going to be more of a case study with progress. Everything I talk about today is going to be told through the lens of my experiences with developing the Lacuna passage. But we'll get to that. First, who am I? Well, I've never actually worked for a AAA game company, and I haven't even released my own game yet that I've been working on as a full-time indie developer of random games. And despite all that, I'm going to try to talk about what it takes to have a AAA mentality as an indie developer. Before we start, to make sure we all know what indie means. So, what is indie? I have no clue. You've probably heard a dozen different definitions from a dozen different impassioned gamer philosophers on the internet. Personally, I think titles like indie and AAA are pretty useless when putting games into categories. It's really more of a spectrum. Games or companies like EA on one side and people like Jonathan Blow on the other. A lot of developers fall somewhere in the middle. I am going to need some general definitions for this talk today, though. So for our purposes, indie is basically someone punching above their weight class. Maybe they don't have as many resources, or as much money, or as much experience, whatever. We know one thing: they're the underdogs compared to the AAA established companies, piles of cash, and years of industry experience. But this visual isn't exactly accurate either. Indies and AAA companies are not fighting each other. It's not a direct competition. It's a fight to find players. Both indies and AAA companies are fighting for your attention. So if this is an indie developer, then this is a AAA developer. That little guy down there is me right now, and I'm not even really sure how I got over the curve. But competing for attention is the second job of an indie developer besides making games. Today I'm going to cover the whole spectrum of developing and marketing as it relates to our experience in the passage so far. You've probably never heard of any of the other games that I've made. Long before I began on the passage, I made a print and play board game called Owen, which made $0. Soon after that, I made an iOS game called Iceberg Frenzy, which was ad supported and made $60. After that, I made a flash puzzle game called Protobotic, and that made a whopping $400. These were small hobby projects that I completed in my free time and never even made enough money to cover the development costs. All this time, I was working a day job within the educational gaming division of a company that rhymes with Quest Guy. I said before, I've never been a part of a AAA game company, but I have been a part of a group that had vast amounts of capital and plenty of talent. We only ever released one product in my time with Quest Guy. After almost 2 years, a team of 15 people and the support of a Fortune 500 company, we had almost nothing to show for it, and the plans for a public product launch were shut down. I left that position before the ship sank and started working as an elementary school computer lab supervisor. I desperately wanted to get back to making games, but this time I wanted to make a game that I would really be proud of, and I was ready to go big or go home. Soon after the landing of the Mars Curiosity rover, I conceived the idea for an exploration and survival game following the first group of human visitors on Mars. I began working on the Lacuna passage in my free time when I wasn't working at the elementary school. When I worked for West Guy, we had learned to use Unity, so that's what I used to build small prototypes. I called in a few favors from the artists and composers I had met, and I started sharing my progress on sites like Reddit. After almost a year, I had a barely passable prototype that I used to launch a Kickstarter campaign. And I raised over $54,000 for a project that survived on a dream and some promises, but I knew I could deliver. I quit my job at the school and I started developing the Lacuna passage full time with my brother. And since the beginning, I had built the game up using the lessons I had learned from previous experiences, especially the failures. So let me tell you about some of the things that I think we're doing right and a few of the things that we might have done wrong. One of the biggest lessons I learned from my previous games was that when you start a new project, it's crucial to design around your limitations. You must define your constraints. These limitations can be many and varied, but some of the common ones are hardware, team size, team skill set, budget, and your available development time. But I have this great idea for a game. I'm just going to dive in and start on it. Well, big, expensive game ideas are great, but if you haven't taken the time to identify your constraints, I guarantee you will discover what they are when you run into them head first. But if I keep my game idea small and defined by tight constraints, then how will it ever be considered AAA indie? Well, first let's talk about the constraints that we worked with for Lacuna Passage, and then I'll get into how to make your game appear bigger than it actually is. So before any real work began on Lacuna Passage, I needed to know what my immediate goal was and who I needed to help me get there. I decided early on that my goal would be to launch the Kickstarter. I knew that my idea in my head was probably, it had potential, and I knew it would require full-time development to realistically achieve. To do that, we would need funding, and Kickstarter seemed like as good an idea as any. And if I didn't get funded, then that would tell me two things. Number one, maybe my idea wasn't as cool as I thought it was. Number two, I might not be cut out for the marketing and promotion side of indie development. In either case, it's not the end of the world, and if any of you are considering doing a Kickstarter, the message here is go for it. You have practically nothing to lose and everything to gain. So that was my logic anyways. I knew the Kickstarter was my ticket to full-time development, but obviously I would have to put in a lot of work prior to launching a campaign. Kickstarters based on concept art don't do very well. To achieve my small prototype, I knew that the smallest possible team would be the most efficient. So I started the whole thing on my own. Most importantly though, I knew that I personally had the skills to complete the basic prototype. And my Kickstarter goals for the prototype without any outside help. It wasn't hubris, it was practicality. My experiences with volunteer teams in the past were less than stellar. So flashback to 5 years ago, I was in school getting a degree for computer graphics and interactive media at the University of Dubuque. And I decided that I wanted a class that encompassed all areas of game design and development. So I pitched a full conversion modding class to the department faculty, in which every student in the class would have a different role that emulated a whole game studio as we worked together on an Unreal Tournament. The faculty approved it, and for an entire year, I led the class as the lead designer. The game we were making was called CLOCKWORK, and it was a third-person steampunk shooter. My first mistake was in assuming that anyone cared about steampunk. And the other mistake was assuming that we all knew what we were doing and that everyone was equally passionate about seeing the project through to completion. We ended up with a page on ModernDB and a handful of art assets after a year of work. We didn't identify our constraints, and no one could be relied on to complete their assignments, including myself. When a project relies on a bunch of volunteer collaborators with unproven talent and uncertain commitment, you're going to have a bad time. So I based my experience with Lacuna Passage, based on my experience with CLOCKWORK, several other smaller failed projects also kind of gave me a lot of insight, and I began working on Lacuna Passage as a team of one. But I did have a couple of close friends who became interested in helping me after they saw my initial progress. I slowly began to add a few contributors to the project that I knew I could trust. But more importantly, they're passionate enough about the idea to ask me if they could help. Those are the kinds of collaborators you want on your project. You want people asking your permission to be part of what you're doing. Before long, I started adding volunteers from outside my circle of friends and who had skill sets I could use. I still knew that I could accomplish my goals on my own, but a team of talented and self-motivated volunteers could get me to my goals much sooner. Finally, if any of you are attempting to tackle a project that requires outside help, I strongly advise against trying to attract talent by putting out classifieds. You'll largely only attract individuals who are looking for a paycheck. And I feel like there are some people who probably disagree that you'll get the most committed work out of people who are being paid to do what they're doing. But oftentimes, as an indie developer, that's just not an option. So if I can't genuinely attract passionate contributors, then I would personally reevaluate my project's scope and see how I can accomplish as much of it on my own as possible. If all of the contributors for Lacuna Passage quit tomorrow, I would still be able to complete the finished project, even though it would probably take me years. So identifying our constraints in relation to our team composition and goals was extremely important, but the design constraints were much more difficult to pin down. The art style was something that I knew I had to figure out relatively quickly. A huge part of the early prototype that I would be featuring on Kickstarter would be the visuals. This is the first screenshot I ever took when I began working on the general look of the game and testing elements of the terrain. At this point in development, I was leaning towards a more Hollywoodized version of Mars, lots of oranges and reds, and super exaggerated well beyond the actual colors of Mars. And this is the first screenshot that I shared publicly on Reddit. The reaction we got was great, but some people were kind of divided on the art style. Many agreed that the stylized colors looked good, but they were more interested in a realistic representation of colors. So I started toning down the orange of the atmosphere. I felt that we were getting closer to what I had in mind, but people still weren't convinced that it was the right art style for the game, especially considering our attention to realism in other areas of the game's design. And now this is what the game looks like today. And actually, how many of you had a chance to play it in the expo area? Awesome. So it's still, before it felt like you were on kind of a fantastical planet in some far-off universe, but we were trying to tell the player that this is Mars. And now that our style matches our narrative, we really feel that way. So this photorealistic style is not typically a good design decision for a small indie team. A more exaggerated style of representation would have likely been easier to produce and it would have resulted in a shorter development time. The Legend of Zelda, obviously a great example that uses an art style that would have hugely reduced the amount of work we needed to build our world. But thankfully, we're largely spared the heavy workload of a photoreal art style by having our game set on Mars. In case you hadn't noticed, Mars is a pretty barren wasteland of rock and dust. So using Mars as a setting for my game was not just something I wanted to do for story reasons. I chose the setting well before I wrote any aspects of the story because I knew it would be a reasonable constraint for the scale of work required by a realistic art style. And setting the game on Mars was not going to solve all of my problems related to the project's scope and scale, though. The story did need its own constraints. I described the story elements of the passage as though you are a Mars detective. A majority of the events that compose the story already happened well before you take control of the main character in the game, and you piece together these past events by investigating context clues around the environment. You read and listen to mission log files that have been left behind by the previous crew. We don't show you any story in cutscenes. You compose the entire history of this world in your mind. Our hope is that players will theorize and share their own interpretations of the passage and the narrative. Thankfully, we've got some great examples of other successful indie games that have already taken the same approach, and we can use them as examples. The recent indie title, Dear Esther, builds an entire game around this concept of contextual storytelling. There's no cutscenes to produce, there's no complicated animations to create. The style of storytelling allowed them to narrow their scope and produce a visually stunning and engaging world. Gone Home is a near perfect comparison to what we're trying to achieve in the passage. Gone Home has a very limited level of player interaction with the narrative components, and that allows for even more meaningful construction of story with some of the smallest overhead from a production standpoint. Just think about how much information is conveyed in this screenshot without the need to animate, record dialogue, or trigger complex scripted sequences. The player can build up these complex character relationships in their mind with just simple suggestions from the game's writer and designer. Another thing that these examples in the passage have in common is our first-person perspective. Obviously, one of the major goals of a first-person camera is to immerse the player in your game's world and have them truly inhabit the character. It just so happens that this is really easy to do from a design standpoint. If you don't want to worry about a third-person character animation or environment interaction, no problem. You just set a camera in there about 6 feet off the ground and you're good to go. First-person perspectives are a no-brainer solution to decreasing your project scope. Early on, I also decided that I wanted the passage to be an open-world game. That probably doesn't sound like a very reasonable design constraint either, and it isn't. But we had several limitations on our open world environment that made it much more manageable. Our mark setting benefits us here once again, but the scale of the environment still makes it difficult even when it's not populated with much more than rocks. Thankfully, Mars is a real place, real terrain that has been extensively scanned by NASA. And guess what? All of that data is freely available to the public. Very little of our environment is created by hand. The entire terrain is more of a patchwork quilt of stitched together height maps blended in Photoshop. And obviously, it takes more than a height map to have a realistic looking Mars, but this process saves us immeasurable amounts of development time. These are just some of the most important design decisions that we made early on in the development of the passage. And these decisions helped us build a manageable foundation for a small team to realistically achieve. Actually executing on our designs required some forethought concerning a few general production and programming questions. The first of which is, which game engine should we use? The answer, the one that you hate the least. The devil you know is better than the one you don't. And as far as I'm concerned, all game engines are little devils. You are going to run into problems with every single one, even if you make your own. I chose Unity because I had nearly 2 years of experience with it already, and I knew exactly what it was capable of doing, or at least I thought I did. In fact, the design decisions that I made even took into account that Unity would be my engine of choice. Gone Home, a game that I knew would be functionally very similar, was already made in Unity, so I knew that I could achieve my primary design goals. And since I was handling all of the development on my own to start, I also had to answer the question of which programming language should I use. Answer, none. When I started the original prototype for the Kickstarter, I did not know how to code any traditional programming languages. All of my previous games have been created with visual programming applications like GameMaker and Stencil. While I had been working in Unity, I became familiar with a similar plugin called Playmaker that used visual programming as well. And the entire original Kickstarter prototype was created without a single line of code. Unfortunately, I should have seen this as the limitation it would become later in development. I had begun using a lot of scripts from the Unity Asset Store, and sometimes I'd need to make changes to them. So I had to learn C# almost out of necessity. I have now converted all of our original prototype functionality over to C#, and the result is it's a better game, but lots of lost development time. Playmaker was effective enough in putting together a proof of concept for crowdfunding, but beyond that, it did not meet my development needs, and I didn't see that at the beginning. As I said, the need to learn C# came about after I had begun utilizing several free and paid scripts from the Unity Asset Store, and after a while, it felt almost like cheating. All these amazing resources that I didn't have to spend time creating myself. Is it okay to cheat like this and cut corners by borrowing other people's work? Answer, yes. My approach to developing the passage has been to cut corners all over the place and then sand them down so they aren't sharp anymore. Here's just a small selection of some of our most used plugins from the Unity Asset Store. This doesn't even begin to cover all the free code samples that we've found and used on the Unity forums and other community wiki pages. The internet is full of resources that can solve your development problems with a simple Google search. And it isn't cheating. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Many of these are extremely polished and professional and can take your game to that AAA level. This is the age of crowdsourced game development. You can take advantage of it. So, perhaps this is the part of my talk that you're here for. And at the risk of sounding like I actually know what I'm talking about, I'm going to make a pretty radical claim. I think I know the secret of being a AAA indie. Marketing. Perhaps that's a bit anticlimactic, but I think it holds true for just about every successful indie game that has been released in the last decade. Marketing is the reason that AAA games are as successful as they are. There's plenty of terrible AAA games that sell millions of copies, and there are plenty of excellent indie games that sell horribly. And the difference is almost always marketing, or more accurately, public awareness. Unfortunately, as an indie, you don't exactly have piles of cash sitting around to advertise your game, so you have to take a different approach. Marketing and public awareness are just dumb words to represent the question, why should anyone care about your game? That's the trick, right? We want people to care about our games. What makes your game AAA in the court of public opinion? Why would someone bother to read even a paragraph about your game? What does it take to have your game mentioned in the same breath with games with actual marketing budgets? And as you work through your development challenges, you should begin to identify some of your game's unique quirks that you can leverage. Since Lacuna Passage hasn't been released yet, I'm going to talk about the things that got us noticed during our Kickstarter and Greenlight campaigns. And in many ways, the things that we originally identified as constraints ended up being your strongest selling points. The first of which is realism. Using the terrain data from NASA was originally a way to save time in creating our landscapes, but it also allowed us to claim a next level attention to realism. Suddenly the headlines were, new Kickstarter game Lacuna Passage brings Mars to life. We were getting endorsements from organizations like Penny for NASA and space-related podcasts like Space Vidcast, groups that are well outside the regular gaming news circuits. Our next marketing bullet point is our in-game photography campaign. Taking photos in Lacuna Passage started out as a way to document my development progress and share it with people on Reddit. But I soon realized I was having just as much fun being an astronaut photographer than I was playing the actual game. So I figured, why not let other people take pictures too? So I began comparing the photography elements of Pokemon Snap in order to explain the mechanic in as few words as possible online. Now, obviously that's not really much like Pokemon Snap, so it's kind of cheating. But saying Pokemon Snap got people way more excited than saying, in our game you can take pictures of rocks and stuff. So perhaps most important in our marketing campaign was our insistence that Lacuna Passage is a narrative-driven experience. From the beginning, it has been easy to compare our game's narrative to the style of other recent indie titles, like I mentioned already, Dear Esther and Gone Home, and then mixing that with other influences like 2001: A Space Odyssey. But I much prefer calling our game a space mystery adventure. Putting the player in the role of Mars detective is much more exciting than just saying you walk around and look at pieces of paper and footprints in the sand. A huge difficulty here has been trying to explain how the narrative will work without giving away details that might spoil the experience. However, sometimes being cryptic actually works in your favor. About halfway through our Kickstarter campaign, we released our third soundtrack preview teaser video. The video is a simple, slowly rotating shot of planet Mars with an example of our soundtrack playing in the background. But if you watch through the entire video, there's a cryptic teaser at the end with a strange black structure coming up out of the Martian landscape. And the inspiration from 2001: A Space Odyssey is heavily intentional, and it worked great. This minute-and-a-half long, completely insignificant video spawned an entire article on Kotaku and gave us more than 20,000 video views. It's important to also note that not once during our entire reference or campaign about our game have we ever mentioned the word aliens. And that's a detail of constant speculation. A lot of people really want to know about what is the mystery behind Lacuna Passage, but we continue to either confirm or deny those speculations. Our unique selling points went a long way in getting us press coverage and attention. There are a bunch of other things that we did to help gather interest for the game. we asked ourselves, how will anyone find our game? One of our first attempts at self-promotion was through the website Reddit. I can't stress enough how important Reddit was for our early success. If you're not familiar with the site, you can basically submit articles, pictures, videos, etc. to any number of subreddits that cater to specific audiences. And if your post fails, practically no one will see it, and if it succeeds, tens of thousands might see it. Early in the development, I posted every week in a thread called Screenshot Saturday, which you guys should all look that up. If you're making an indie game, go on Reddit and look for Screenshot Saturday. And it's not only a great way to get exposure, you also get tons of constructive feedback that can help shape your game. And for us, that included the change to our atmospheric colors for the art style. Beyond that, we also we've posted like dozens of standalone screenshots, videos, and articles over the last year for the game. Reddit was our largest source of traffic for our Kickstarter. And so as you can see here, of our dashboard for our Kickstarter campaign, these are all the sources of traffic and donations that we got. Direct traffic being number one, and then the video game section on the Kickstarter website being number two. And our largest external reference was Reddit. So, and you can also consider that a good portion of direct traffic probably learned about us from Reddit. And it's still one of our largest sources for website traffic. Here you can see this is just last month. We had 769 hits from Reddit. I knew that we couldn't rely on external sites for all of our self-promotion though. So I began documenting my development progress in a monthly blog on the Random Seed Games website. And today we've made more than 30 posts, which help to improve our search results on Google and often lead to unexpected traffic. Early in the development of the game, I did a tutorial dev blog on how I was creating the terrain for the game. And it was linked to from blendernation.com. To date, it has given us over 5,000 hits. Those are visits from a site that caters to 3D artists who might not have ever been aware that Lacuna Passage exists through other coverage that we've gotten. A single post that took me an hour is now the second largest source of traffic on our website, even a year after posting it. These numbers are the visitors to our site just last month again, and this tutorial has had the longest tail of any blog post that we've ever done. It's been easy to keep up the practice of writing these dev blogs now, also considering we have almost 2,000 Kickstarter backers who want to hear about our progress as often as possible. In addition to the dev blog, we occasionally produce promotional videos as well. Video content is the single most shareable, informative kind of content that you can make. It helps if you have some experience in video production, but even just talking over a development diary is a great way to communicate with potential followers. And journalists love embedding videos. In fact, there's a weird trend of just like putting 2 sentences after video and calling it their article. Screenshots aren't going to cut it though. Everyone has screenshots. Plus, screenshots don't conveniently link back to your own personally managed channel like YouTube does. Last but not least, we can't forget about social media channels. Facebook and Twitter accounts haven't been that hugely influential for us, but they're certainly worth having as an easy way to interact with your followers and to monitor if other people are talking about your game in real time. Building up a respectable social media presence can take some time, but you don't want to ignore any channel that your followers are trying to use to communicate. So in our experience, paying attention to these 2 marketing questions have helped allow us to run both a successful Kickstarter campaign and a Steam Greenlight campaign. And some of you might have noticed that I left out one pretty big method of self-marketing though, which is directly contacting the press. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is some kind of black magic. Like it takes a ton of work and we found very limited success. I would much rather commit our resources to other self-promotion methods, but perhaps you'll discover the secret formula. In our experience, like everything that we've put on Reddit and posted on our own website has led to journalists contacting us, asking for interviews and stuff like that. So it's been a waste of time for us to just like try and like mass email people, and then oftentimes if your email isn't well received, they can blacklist you because they just find you annoying. So I'm far from an expert on any of the things that I've discussed today, but I hope that by sharing my experiences, I've helped to give you guys some perspective. The truth is that indie, AAA indie is a pretty meaningless term. Your games have meaning. So go make games, get people to care about what you're making, and then when other people care, you're going to make better games. So thank you for coming in, and if you guys have any questions, I can stick around. I think we have plenty of time left for the session. So. Thanks.
How is the transition from going to visual-based scripting to actual hardcore scripting?
That's a good question. I think I've been doing visual scripting for long enough that I have had a really firm understanding of programming logic. I just didn't know the syntax of any particular coding language. It didn't take me that long, but the hardest thing for me was like getting a grasp on the syntax. So like when I first started in C#, I would spend probably like 3 hours a day looking at reference documents and Unity forms and stuff. But now it's gotten to the point where I have a lot of the like general Unity syntax memorized, so I can type well and program pretty much what I need. I'm sure I do a horrible job because I'm not very experienced, but I think it gets the job done. And that's to say also, I don't have a problem with visual scripting in general. Like I still even use it for parts of like prototyping features and stuff. And I think you can make pretty crazy big games using visual scripting. So I recommend if you're not familiar with, if you're not a coder and you want to learn how to code, I think it's a great way to start too. So, you have a question?
Yeah, 2 questions. One, how big is your team now? And the second one would be, so that Kickstarter money, I'm assuming you have to pay taxes on that?
Yeah, so our team is, we have 2 full-time people right now, myself and my brother, and I pretty much do a majority of the like programming, story, and promotion stuff, and my brother does full-time art development. We have a bunch of volunteer contributors still, which is what I was talking about earlier, where during our Kickstarter campaign, we got obviously quite a bit of attention during that time, and a lot of people started asking if they can help out just to like improve their portfolio or just get experience or whatever. So we still have about 3 or 4 volunteer artists, and then we have a composer in Australia, and we've got I think that's it. And then another programmer too, so he does a little bit of like Q&A stuff for us. And then taxes on Kickstarter money. Yes, you have to pay taxes. They basically count it as income. So it's like you've got a giant $54,000 paycheck and you have to pay income tax on it. So yeah, it's not nice. If you know what you're doing and you talk to a lawyer, there are things they can do to like defer the tax payment, because part of it is that like we haven't actually released a product yet. So I'm paying taxes on money that is going to go towards the product, but then they're taking it out before I can even do that. So if you know the right people, or if you want to take the time to look into it yourself and research it, you can get like the tax payment deferred, which we're doing. It helps a little bit. So yeah.
And I'm curious, in all your different media channels you're using for promotion, YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and dev blogs, before you started doing any of that, did you have a regular schedule in mind? Like you said, you posted YouTube videos maybe, or like dev blogs once a month, for example.
Yeah, when I first started, it was a way, like, especially if you're starting something as a hobby project, I treated it like a job. Like I gave myself a weekly schedule. I was like, okay, I have to make a dev blog at the end of this week. So if I don't get anything done this week, I won't have anything to write about. So that was the main thing that I did. It was weekly when I started, and then now that we're kind of more popular, it's harder to keep up with that stuff and have like meaningful stuff to share that I haven't already shown before. So now we do a dev blog about once a month.
What's the biggest roadblock encountered on the project?
I mean, probably just inexperience. Like, I've kind of been thrust into the position of making a game that's that people think is made by someone more experienced. So, it probably takes me a lot longer to do things than someone else who's already worked for a AAA company or who's made other successful indie games before. Like part of that is our Kickstarter campaign. We set our projected completion date as December of this year, but that's not going to happen. So, I mean, there's always a huge issue of like, if you've never dealt with this before, you're making a new game, type of game you've never made before, you're going to run into like all kinds of unforeseen things. But we try to limit that as much as possible by identifying as many of them before we even started. So that was kind of the biggest thing with my talk. Like, even before you start your game, like, try to identify as many of those as you can, and then design around that instead of like, I could have made this like a game full of cutscenes and like. You could be driving rovers around Mars, and it could be like 100 square miles. Like, that's an awesome idea for a game, but I can't make that game. So that's where we try to identify as many of the roadblocks ahead of time as possible. Yeah.
How long did it take you to make the prototype for Kickstarter, and how much actual marketing or self-promotion did you do before your Kickstarter?
Yeah, so before the Kickstarter, it took me almost a year of part-time development because this was I still had another full-time job. So I come home and do about 2-3 hours of work each night and then work all weekend. I said, all right, I did the dev blogs each week, but you know, at that point I was already starting. I already had the website set up, so I was posting screenshots for that. I Reddit, Screenshot Saturday every week. There's tons and tons of places that you can do that kind of self-promotion. Right now, I think that Reddit is one of the best. But IndieDB, or not DB, well, IndieDB is okay. But then, TIG Source, the TIG forums, the indie gaming, it's TIGSource.com. There are forums. They have really, really active members there that have been there for like a decade. And they have like really good professional indie developers too that have really successful games going and give awesome constructive feedback on their games and stuff. So that's another great place to do it. Yeah.
Hi, you mentioned the importance of passionate contributors. What do you do with a person who's not meeting deadlines, but you brought the guy on the team and at first he was passionate about it and you really liked him, but now he's consistently missing deadlines or, you know, just doesn't seem interested. How do you handle people like that?
Sure. So how do you handle people that seem passionate at first, but then kind of lose interest or stop contributing? That's definitely something we've dealt with. My philosophy so far has just been dropping like a bag of rocks. Like I have no time for people to to string me along and pretend like they want to be involved but not actually do anything. So I've kind of set up a system. After being burned a few times by that, I set up a system where I really only give assignments to volunteer contributors that are kind of a non-priority. And so it's all stuff that will need to get done eventually, but it's not important right now. And that way, if they don't get it done, I'm not lost out on any deadlines. And I don't have to try and like hound them to get stuff done. I don't have to like spend my valuable time trying to make sure that they're doing their job. The best success I've had with contributors, some of my favorite volunteer contributors can only work like maybe an hour or two a week, but I know they're going to get done and I don't have to babysit them. So. Any other questions? Yeah.
So for those volunteers, if this game does take off and make a bunch of money, do they sign agreements with you that you're going to pay them, or I mean, I don't know how that works.
Sure. It's honestly a question that we're still trying to answer ourselves. We have kind of a loose idea of what we want our contracts to be with these contributors, and so there is an expectation of some kind of reimbursement for their time. But like I said before, they really care more about the game than they do about any kind of financial outcome on their own. And I'm the same way. Like, all I care about is I make enough money on this so I can make another game, and they all feel the same way. So thankfully, it's not something where I have to like worry about competition amongst group, like who's going to make the most money or who's going to get their fair share or whatever. But I do want to make sure that they get rewarded for the amount of time that they spend. So we're trying to work out a type of contract that basically it's like micro percentages based on like individual assets that they complete. So for artists, we give them something like 0.01% of profits for a small 3D asset or something like that. So we try to equate the amount that they get based on an estimated number of sales that we think is reasonable, and equate that to what they should have gotten paid if I had one. I don't know if it's going to work out, but I mean, it's probably easier to just set like a specific percentage that would be expected, that someone might expect in return for a specific amount of work that they do. But this way, some of our contributors that can only do a couple hours here and there, they don't have to be set to like a specific schedule, and they can kind of complete whatever they're able to complete when they are able to. All right, well, if there's no more questions, I'll be out in the expo area with our game. And so if you want to play it, we'll be out there for another, I guess, when does it close? Like 4? I think the expo area. So we might pack up a little before 4, but there'll be plenty of time to come ask more questions if you have any, and play the game if you haven't yet. So thank you again for coming. Appreciate it.